So the last time I was talking Marvel, I dropped a hint that we would be talking about the Thor franchise. Specifically, we're talking about the former leading lady, Dr. Jane Foster. My favorite character. And no, she's not just my favorite because she's played by Natalie Portman. If anything, it's the reverse. I fell in love with Natalie Portman because I fell in love with Jane Foster.
Needless to say, it makes me very prickly when someone calls her useless or just a love interest, and so this episode is dedicated to proving just how wrong those ignorant dipsticks are.
And to prove I'm not the only one who thinks this, bring me a cameo.
Hello, my name is Roz, and I run a Let's Talk account about Jane Foster, and have been a huge Jane Foster stan for about 6 years, since just before Thor the Dark World came out. I admired her before then, after I saw the first Thor movie, but after the Dark World I actually started reading some Thor comics and kind of fell in love with her there too. I fell down a comic book rabbit hole after that, after the then unknown female Thor was introduced. After that it was revealed to be Jane. I just never stopped. And I've always been a comic book reader, but I sort of became interested in her history like quite recently, and binge read a lot of Jane Foster comics from both before and after she became Thor. Jane was first introduced in Journey into Mystery number 84 way back in September 1962. I would not recommend any of Jane's early appearances. It was the 60s, it was bad. The rest is silly, kitschy fun, but if you care one iota about Jane as a character, you'll want to pretend none of this exists.
Hold up. Holy crap, this is 15 minutes long? Okay, I'm gonna put this all in an extra video, and well, first of all, thank you, Rosalind Moses of Do You Even Comic Book. Mwah. I love you. You can follow her on Twitter. She is fantastic. Okay, so Cliff Note summary of Jane Foster in the comics. She was originally Thor's love interest and the subordinate to his alter ego, Dr. Donald Blake, working as a nurse. She has since evolved. She is now a doctor in her own right. She and Thor have been kind of on again, off again, as comics are wont to do, mostly thanks to Odin wanting to keep his son away from the stinky mortal. And so it has gone on that way for some time. In the early 2010s, she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and around the same time, Thor became unworthy, and Jane, who was staying in the Asgard colony Asgardia, went to the moon and picked up Mjolnir, and now she is Thor, Goddess of Thunder. Except every time she transforms into the Goddess of Thunder, chemotherapy gets burned out of her, which is disappointing because that means it's killing her. And so she was Thor for several years under the guardianship of Jason Aaron, who is apparently a very good writer for Thor, but not so much for the X-Men. That's tangential. Anyway, Jane stopped being Thor because she did a heroic sacrifice where she gave up Mjolnir, and so cancer killed her, but then she got to Valhalla and she was like, you know what, no, I'm not gonna do that. And so she came back to life, and Thor is Thor again now, and Jane is sent to, get cancer free. Which she does! Hooray! And so then during the War of the Realms event, she picked up another hammer and became Thor very, very briefly, and then that hammer transformed and she became the new Valkyrie. Yay! I wish I had expendable income to blow on comics. So now let's talk about Jane on screen.
We can't ignore that Natalie Portman did have a big impact on how Jane is portrayed in the movies, and we will get to it, but there is a bit of a stepping stone that needs to be mentioned first. That is the animated series Avengers: Earth's Mightiest Heroes. The series was airing at the time Thor was in production and featured Jane in several episodes, voiced by Kari Wahlgren.
And she and Thor are adorable in this series. I mean, the height difference alone is precious!
Given how enormous the cast was, she was never really a main player, but the show made it pretty clear that she was a major factor in Thor's decision to stay on Earth. Not just because he was crushing on her, but because he admired her bravery and her willingness to do what she thought was right, even when it meant running into danger.
Which is, what a hero does.
The series was rather hastily cancelled, which meant that Thor and Jane's frisson never really culminated in anything, but she was a good, solid secondary character, and that heroic spark is one of the things that made it into the films.
Speaking of which, let's get into that, shall we?
There were two major reasons Natalie Portman was excited about playing Jane. One was the chance to work with director Kenneth Branagh, and the other was the way Jane's profession had evolved for the script. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with being a nurse, but the idea of playing an astrophysicist, a profession in which women are still very much underrepresented, was especially appealing, since she knew that this movie was going to be a big deal, and little girls who were interested in science would probably be delighted to see a woman with that same passion on the big screen.
Before she is Thor's girlfriend, Jane Foster in the MCU is her own woman, a woman of science. And I think that was a big part of what confused audiences when it came to her character.
For the first 2/3 of the movie, Jane's gender is largely incidental in terms of the actions she takes and how she is presented. The camera never frames her as an object, and a lot of her behavior has performative connotations of masculinity.
And everything I know about this phenomenon is either in this lab or in this book, and you can't just take this away. Hey!
This is very similar behavior to what we see Thor doing at multiple points during the narrative. The difference is that Jane is a victim of telling rather than showing.
The script in general has a bit of a problem with info-dumping character traits rather than letting actions speak for themselves. Jane in particular gets the short end of this, as the audience gets to see very little of her actually doing science.
Or at least not the kind of science that a movie can make exciting through a montage the way they do for fandom's beloved science bros Tony and Bruce.
Jane's proficiency in science is instead limited largely to jargon, which may or may not be translated for the benefit of Darcy and the audience, and so we just have to accept that she's good at what she does, whereas with Thor, we see his skills in action.
And of course, Thor is our protagonist, which means there's actually, effort being put into articulating his arc, whereas Jane's is all subjects. How do I change the ringtone on this thing? Hello?
You promised I could be in on this. I suffered through Ragnarok for this. You're keeping your promise?
Okay, so put that writing degree of yours to good use and explain the importance of character parallels, will ya?
Right. So, especially as a novelist, the story arc is something that means a lot to me. And the first Thor actually subverts one of the basic orders of storytelling, which is stasis, or the status quo, before the plot begins with the trigger. We don't quite know what stasis is because the movie begins with Jane.
You all forgot that was the first scene, didn't you? Continue.
Jane is the first person we're introduced to because she's the one who's going to be the key to the audience understanding Thor, the key to both the plot and the character development that happens in this movie. Now, Thor is thrown out of the Bifrost, which we know as an occurrence from Jane's point of view and research, and gets hit by Jane's van. This is now the trigger. This has changed something, but we don't know what has changed because we don't know the backstory. Now we're here with our main characters, whose lives have both been completely upturned. We have Jane Foster, astrophysicist who had to fight for, create, and do everything for herself on her own. And we have Thor Odinson, who has had a very cushy life as Prince of Asgard, and is finally understanding what it means to have nothing. Kind of.
This drink, I like it.
I know, it's great, right?
Another!
The meme that launched 1,000 misunderstood characterizations.
Going back to those matching personalities, charging into a government site to get your stuff back with absolutely no plan is about as reckless as sneaking onto an enemy planet to knock giant heads together after your dad explicitly told you not to do that. Now, the former is decidedly less action-packed than the latter,
Which, granted, is kind of what people want to see in a comic book movie.
but the eventual failure of their ill-conceived plans results in both Thor and Jane hitting rock bottom. We haven't seen the consequences of Jane's actions play out in the same way as we've seen Thor's, but there are flashes there.
This is the moment when they are both vulnerable enough to break down their walls and let each other in. They're no longer using each other for personal gain, and in something of a trope reversal, it is Thor who emotionally validates Jane by offering reassurances that her theories are right.
Here is where the story forces Jane and Thor to look at each other as a person on their own terms, with completely unlikely backstory that makes them the most singularly helpful person in their transformations as characters in this movie. They learn that they are not so different. Science and magic, one and the same thing. It's a beautiful moment from a storytelling perspective, a distinctly human moment, because it's empty of all agendas. They have no motivations here. nothing more to hide from each other. They're both stripped down to the core of who they are, and they're both missing everything that they know. And the story lets them find peace with each other, hope with each other, in this moment.
And from a feminist perspective, it's especially crucial.
This is the first time in the movie we've seen anyone actually give Jane this kind of acknowledgement. Even Eric, her mentor and father figure, is dismissive of her ideas. This is the moment when her gender becomes explicit. Up until this point, her identity was largely incidental where it pertained to the plot.
Aside from things like, getting little hand kisses and checking out the admittedly impressive abs of Chris Hemsworth, which have less to do with the plot and are more to do with character than anything else. And let's be real, gay, straight, asexual, bisexual, pansexual, everyone has checked out Chris Hemsworth at least once. He's very pretty.
Oh, yes he is. Those eyes, smile, arms.
That wasn't an invitation to check him out now! Focus! We're talking about Jane and feminism!
It is this moment on the rooftop where the characterizing subtext of her gender comes to fruition. You might remember from the Ghostbusters review that STEM is not a particularly female-friendly field, and taking that knowledge into account makes Jane's personality make a lot more sense.
She's fed up with being doubted and determined to prove everybody wrong and leave her mark in the world. Who does that remind me of? No, don't worry, it'll come to me.
When I invoked a trope reversal, I was referring to films where the role of the female lead is to act as emotional support to the genius male lead more than anything else. I think it says a lot about Thor as a character that he's so ready to reassure Jane when he's arguably in a worse place than she is, emotionally speaking.
Hearing all the lies Loki told him would put anyone in a spiral, but not Thor. The next day is when Thor and Loki have their fight via destroyer in New Mexico. Thor is a man of action, and when he tells Jane that he's staying, she says, well, so am I, because that's the kind of woman she is. She will do whatever she can, and she can help with the evacuation. She is a woman who understands her limitations, just like Thor does in this scene, when he knows he can't fight the Destroyer and leaves that to Sif and the Warrior Straight. This parallel is one of the strongest that's made, one of the major definitions of who they are as people.
There's a deleted scene of her, Darcy, and Eric getting civilians out of Puente Antigua when the Destroyer attacks. And although the movies tend to make it a punchline more often than not, Thor is pretty consistent in being a supportive feminist ally.
And who proved wrong all who scoffed at the idea that a young maiden could be one of the fiercest warriors this realm has ever known?
I did.
True, but I supported you, Sif.
She's holding up all right. For now.
She's strong in ways you'd never even know. I think it's great that there is an elite force of women warriors. It's about time.
Attaboy, Thor. Attaboy.
Like Bruce and Betty before them, Thor and Jane are soft, sweet, and dorky, but they are on more equal ground thanks to a narrative that gives more time to developing Jane as a character outside of Thor. That's why it's a good thing that their romance doesn't start until the last third of the movie. It allows us to see Jane as a character in her own right rather than as Thor's girlfriend. And the way she ends the movie shows that it's her decision to be with him. She's the one to initiate their big damn kiss, and the last we see of her suggests that she's going to keep up her work, like Thor encouraged her to do, with the additional goal of finding him.
Jane is not just a trophy for Thor. They are equal participants in a relationship where they both need to grow and change in order to be worthy of one another.
And the final scene is Jane gazing up at the sky, the fire in her belly burning hotter than ever, because she knows that her science is right. And all she has to do is figure out how to connect their worlds again.
Maybe even work with S.H.I.E.L.D. to do it, but then a whole lot of stuff happened.
The first thing that derailed the Fosterson train is Natalie Portman becoming pregnant with her first child right around the time Avengers was filming.
So Jane was originally supposed to be in the Avengers movie, most likely filling the role that Eric Selvig ended up playing, but allegedly Joss Whedon is not a fan of working with pregnant actresses thanks to Charisma Carpenter's pregnancy derailing a season of Angel, and it wasn't an option to wrap her belly in green screen the way they did a few years later for Scarlett Johansson or Gal Gadot in Wonder Woman, and so Jane was just written out of the movie. All you get's a picture.
Obviously, the movie still functioned, but it lost quite a bit of emotional weight since Jane's involvement had been foreshadowed.
Don't tell me it was that woman! Oh, it was. Well, maybe when we're finished here, I'll pay her a visit myself!
No, you won't. But of course the Avengers made banana balls amounts of money and Natalie still had a 3-picture deal with 2 movies left, so it was sequel time. And that's where things really started getting crazy, so strap in everyone because next time we talk, it's gonna be about phase 2.
Merci beaucoup for watching. Please be sure to like, leave comments, share, and subscribe. I would love to make these videos more often, but to do that, I need your help fending off the YouTube algorithm.
As always, my Patreon is open for fan support. You can get early access, cameo privileges, membership to the chat room to overthrow the patriarchy, and future requests. Additionally, we still have the Indiegogo running for Hidden Thorns if you need a refresher on what that is. Thank you very much. I will see you very soon. A bientôt!